Actually doing something quite unusual today. It's something of a first. We're going live over social media. So I know, for example, that Amy, who's with OSU up in Corvallis neighborhood, is going to be listening to us as she weeds right now. So,
hi, Amy.
so we have it's an interesting dimension, and one of the other interesting aspects about using Facebook Live is that this will be archived. So if there's anything you've missed, you can go back to it. And or if you want to point people at it, you can. I fully suspect we might have a larger audience watching it in the aftermath than we do here today. I think we'll probably end up doing more of this as we sort of step into that pattern of embrace. I should just start by offering a quick word of thanks. I don't know, is Ravi and Madhu here?
Ravi was
okay. Just a little bit in the way of context for those of you who are not too aware of where we're at. We're in the Vistara Garden Sanctuary, which is the second major property on Horn Lane. We have another property down the road called Dharmalaya, which is part of this integral yoga community. It's an interesting adventure in beauty and truth. It's probably one of the more evolved examples of sort of what you might call an integral yoga community in the country. An effort to bring conscious living to conscious community to conscious food. The fact that we're literally sitting on some of the finest soils in the country, on one of the most conscious cities in the Western world, lends this sort of effort particular momentum. It's no mistake that you're here today and that we're sharing with you. You're part of that extended narrative and our extended family and this extended effort to basically bring a higher sanity to the world. So, fall and winter cropping. I generally start a conversation about fall and winter cropping by with a very simple statistic. I tend to think of fall and winter cropping as basically eating out of the garden in the October, November, December, January, February, March, April, May time frame. It's about 8 months. And I'll often think of the spring and summer harvest season as June, July, August, September. July, August, September, if things are moving a little slowly in terms of the climate and planting. In other words, we're talking about a harvest season that's twice the length of the spring-summer season. In other words, if you're looking at making a coherent effort at feeding yourself year-round, the fall and winter harvest season is crucial to tend to. Of course, eating through fall and winter doesn't just mean growing food through fall and winter. A large part of our summer gardens are devoted to storage crops. We've got our alliums, we've got our potatoes, we've got our tomatoes, we've got all the other crops that we're putting up. I don't know, did you want to speak a little bit to that topic, Chris, in terms of the breadth of the whole picture, the year-round eating and what fall and winter diet means?
Yeah, so fall, winter, and early spring diet to me includes a couple classes of things. So it's crops that either spanning a little bit like perennials, you know. So you're pulling down your apples and nuts. Like chestnuts are totally overlooked. I recommend everybody with these paper write down grow chestnuts because that's going to be one of our most durable crops for the future. Anyway, so there's yes, sir.
Whatever happened to chestnut? Like, how does that
Let's. I'd like to. We'll answer that question at the end, but let's go focus.
So the first is crops that you're going to pull down and you're going to store. Nick just touched on them, and the next are things that persist, and so it can be the last few tomatoes that you're eking out towards the end of the season. It can be lettuces that you're pampering, and you know that a hard frost is going to take them down, but you can get you can get some harvest from them. It could be root crops, kind of more sensitive root crops like beets or carrots, which depending on how well the season goes, you can extend them. You can also bring those into the first category. You can also pull those up and put them in wet sand, so you can make those first category. And then there are things that are actually bona fide winter crops that sit and stay. And
slows very markedly indeed. It drops off quite precipitously in the weeks leading up to that, but generally you really want to be sure that everything is sized up to the point you want it to be sized up by the early part of November. One of the reasons you'll find that timing is absolutely crucial to fall and winter cropping is because essentially we're planting our entire garden or farm into declining light levels, declining temperature levels, and it basically falls off in a curve. What we find is that if you miss a seeding date, or you miss a seeding week, or you miss a seeding month in the spring and summer, it doesn't matter too much because everything's on the rise. You can basically sow into the rise, and stuff that you'll sow 2 or 3 weeks later will catch up with stuff that you sowed on the earlier side. This side of the solstice, things are very different. Every day we delay is more than a day lost. And specifically, it's important not simply to get your sowing dates timed well, but your transplant dates. I remember the first time I started moving them on agricultural professionals, the guys who breed and steer crops for multinationals, and they were always talking about the transplant dates rather than the seeding dates. So what was that all about? And then I found out soon enough is that you can sow your seed on the right date, but if you're delaying on your transplanting, even if it's just a week or two, you may as well have seeded a week or two later. So it's very, very, very crucial to get your transplanting dates right. I experimented a lot with transplanting timings when I first started exploring fall and winter cropping about 15 years ago. And typically what I did is I found that I settled in on doing almost all my seeding the first 2 weeks in July. What I've found is that in the last 4 or 5 years, that's shifted. Now I'm doing the vast majority of my seeding, which of the mainstay crops for fall and winter cropping, which are your brassicas. The brassicas are generally the crops that provide the diversity, the size, the taste, the hardiness. And by brassicas, I'm generally talking about the Oleracea family, the kales, the collards, the broccolis, the cabbages, so on and so forth. I don't know why it doesn't work to sow seeds the first 2 weeks in July the way it used to, but it doesn't. I'll also say that 4 or 5 years ago when I was teaching these, just a second, let me finish this thought.
Yeah, we left out a piece.
Yeah, when do you do it now?
If you don't do it the first
We'll get to that.
Okay.
Okay. So the first, I've lost my train of thought.
I'm sorry.
Really want to answer.
You were speaking about the shift that's occurring. in
Okay,
transplanting.
4 or 5 years ago, I considered myself right at the forefront of having a complete understanding of just about everything that was going on in terms of fall and winter cropping in our bioregion. The types of varieties that were available, the types of cultural techniques that were being used. In the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a huge upsurge in terms of interest in growing food into and through winters. When I began 15 years ago, there was one farm in our bioregion I was aware that was running a winter CSA. There are now a whole slew. And with that degree of interest and professionalism, and to a degree, as a response, the number of additional varieties that are becoming more readily accessible in our bioregion, and the degree and the different techniques that are being applied, I certainly don't consider myself as having a full and complete understanding of what's going on. I think that story is particularly where I feel relatively weak. Tends to be around greenhouse growing, or what we hoop house growing, and growing in food in early spring. That's not just simply seeding crops in very early spring to push out extremely quick harvests, but seeding late in the fall to transplant in early spring to produce early harvests. There's a vast amount of room that still exists for people to explore novel approaches to winter cropping in our bioregion. We've only just sort of to a degree scraped the surface. We have the fundamentals somewhat in place, but there's still a lot of room to explore. One of the other complicating factors that's coming in for us is shifts in weather patterns. We used to be relatively clear or reliable in terms of how our falls were going to go, how our winters were going to go, how our springs were going to go. Everything's getting a little bit more mixed up. One of the reasons I think we've seen this trend to sow earlier, and the key seeding window for most of our brassicas now, I would say, is the second through fourth week in June. One of the reasons for that is because what we're consistently trying to do is stack the odds in our favour. There are a great many unknowns when you're basically putting plants into the ground, many of which are going to be in the ground for a full 9 months. A lot of variables, a lot of weather variables, certainly, to play with. Maybe that's something you'd like to see with in terms of sort of the bioregional shifts and changes.
I do. I think that what he's getting at, and what I'd like to stress, is that even if you do have all your ducks in a row, this isn't to dismay anybody, but just to be realistic. It is a bit of a gamble. You know, you have the best genetics, and still, if we have a freakishly cold winter, you might lose all your cabbages, or every root crop could rot out. And so there's a guy named Charles Dowding. He's an Englishman. He's done a lot of work with winter gardening and leafy greens, and he was one of the early advocates, along with Nancy Bubel, if that's how you pronounce her name, B-U-B, that were basically advocating looking at wild weeds. There are a lot of weeds that people don't really consider to eat that are actually quite edible. Like, for instance, chickweed and lamium. If the lamium doesn't have powdery mildew on it, that's quite common.
So we can refer to it as red dead nettle,
Right.
or
Right.
red archangel.
Right. So there's a whole slew of wild greens that either are already in our gardens or that can be planted, that have a wider range of flavors that maybe, Americans want everything, not chewy, not bitter, not hairy, not this, not that. It's all got to be all boxed in perfectly, right? But if we can kind of look beyond that and see the health effects of these wild plants that grow in our gardens readily as weeds, then that's kind of one thing that we can shore against our losses of our crops, the actual crops that we're putting in the ground. So anyway, that's...
Yeah. And of course, there's a very great deal that we can do to improve the survivability of the crops that we grow through the winter. I recall some years ago, temperatures got down to a record minus 10 degrees in Eugene. I think we've never seen anything like it before. And what I was aware of is that gardeners had more success carrying crops through that weather than any of our local farmers. We'd never seen anything like it before. I got on social media as the weather was coming in and started putting the word out. It was like, what do we do? There were a group of locals who'd moved here from the Midwest who said, give up. The damn thing. And there's certainly a degree of intelligence in that. One of the things I've learned through the years is that if I am intending to try to protect my crops in the case of hard weather events, is have the tools in place ready to go if necessary. So as that weather front came in, boom, I was out there with my hoops on my crops. I had my greenhouse dressed up. I had floating row cover down on my crops in the greenhouse. And I was able to take a vast percentage of my crops through minus 10-degree weathers. Every book out there will tell you that's impossible. It's not. You can do it using low and intermediate tech approaches and a fair degree of intelligence. And because we work at a relatively small scale, we have the capacity to do that. It's not easy for us to go out and collect a field full of brassicas. We do have that opportunity, that freedom to do it.
I would also like to say that utilizing some of the things you have around you, like leaves. Leaves are underlooked, and if you're running into a problem where you fear that you're going to lose something, people. I don't really recommend using carpet anymore because of the though it was popular at one time. But burlap sacks, leaves. A lot of things survive. They survive cold, but they don't survive cold wet. Cold and wet, or cold and frozen water surrounding the plant is something that will definitely knock out a lot of plants. But if you can somehow keep it. Now it rains obviously during this period, but if you can keep less moisture, not a lot of excessive moisture around it when it's going into a heavy freeze period, you can allow a lot of things to survive, or at least and if they do take on damage, they don't take on a significant damage. So.
Chris hit on a very good point here. In our bioregion, it's in terms of our winter crops, more often than not, it's not the cold that's actually taking it out, it's the combination of cold and particularly moisture. Lettuce, for example, is extraordinarily winter hardy. Many varieties can freeze solid for weeks at a time, thaw out and be fine. But what takes lettuce out in our bioregion is the moisture. Rot, disease, typically they tend to be tend to hit them very hard. I tend to rely on lettuce very little in the course of winters. If I am generally going to grow it, I have a choice. Am I going to grow it inside a greenhouse, or am I going to grow it outside a greenhouse? One of the very, very primary suggestions I make to people whenever they come to our bioregion, they say, Nick, what can I do to graze food? I'll say, put up as big and expensive a greenhouse as you can possibly get away, and as you can possibly aesthetically, financially, and everything get away with, because it makes a huge difference to your capacity to raise food year round. We particularly see them coming into their own over the course of winters. I generally eat a fresh salad every day of the winter, as distinct from the summer. The winter is my major salad season, not the summer. And what you'll typically find is that the quality to salad greens grown through the winter, they have an energetic that's really quite exceptional. It's quite amusing. You can sense it in people. I go to potlucks over the course of winters. In the summer, people turn up with salads, they're a dime a dozen. If you turn up to a local potluck with a well-made salad in the middle of the winter, woof, I mean, it disappears in a matter of seconds. It's extraordinarily popular, not just because it's unusual, but because there's an aspect to it that feeds something very critical. Frank Morton would say it has the way lettuce, for example, has an impact on brain function. But I typically find that if I'm feeling blue in the winter, or depressed, or my diet has strayed, or I've been sick, and I'm wanting to bring my mental acuity, or the modulation of my consciousness back to a place where I'm feeling lighter and saner again, 3 or 4 days of winter salads tends to do it more effectively than just about any other crop. That said, I tend not to put lettuces in greenhouses because I like the space in greenhouses. It's a little too valuable oftentimes for me to be putting lettuces in. Lettuces tend to be a little disease prevalent, so they tend to need more in the way of air circulation. So you tend to need to give them more room, and you tend to be fussy. You sort of have to eat the outside leaves off them to stop them succumbing to disease. What I prefer to put into greenhouses in the winters for my salads are crops that are very disease resistant, that I can pack in really tightly, and then I can cut and come again, harvest off repeatedly. So I tend to go very strong on the spinaches, the arugulas, and the mizunas, for example, in terms of the greenhouse space that I devote to winter cropping. And then if I've got a little bit more space, then I start flushing it out with maybe some brightly coloured lettuces and so on and so forth. But really, fundamentally, what we're looking to do in terms of an overall plan for which crops are we going to choose to put onto our winter gardens, and then which types, which varieties within those crop types, some key factors to consider. The number one factor is the size of your garden. Do you have a small garden or do you have a large garden? That'll determine the proportion you tend to devote to particular crop types. If you've got a small garden, you're basically going to want to have a lot of survivability in there. You're not going to put in crops that are going to take up a bunch of space and probably might not make it through the winter. If you've got a large amount of space, you can put in crops that are a little riskier. Our overwintering cauliflowers, for example, that might mature in April and May, they tend to be less hardy than the other heading brassicas. They tend to be more susceptible to snow damage, for example. Now, these very spreading habits, so when snow comes in, the leaves snap off. They're out there for much longer, far more susceptible to the possibility of harder weather coming in. They take up a lot of room. They're big plants. So if you have a small amount of space, and they can be a little fussy to grow in the first place. So if you have a small amount of space, they're generally not something I would recommend. Having said that, we're incredibly rich in crops that you can eat, that you can harvest off repeatedly throughout the whole winter. The kales and collards, the leafy brassicas, the sort of the cornerstone of our fall and winter garden.
Parsley.
Parsley, slow growing. Again, that's a crop that we want to be seeding even earlier, typically than June. Some of our crops we're wanting to be seeding in March, April, May timeframe. Our leeks, our celeriac, our parsleys, even our chards to a degree. We're still sowing chards now, but some of these crops, it really helps to get them sized up early.
Did you say parsnips as well?
Parsnips.
Yeah, parsnips are another one. It all depends on how you like your parsnips. Honestly, parsnips just chipped up and fried are really wonderful. And the bigger ones I've found actually, they store a little bit longer. They seem to store a little bit longer even at crisper. You can also throw them in sand too, or under leaves if you do dig them up. But it's best usually just to leave them in the ground until you need them. But if you've got an issue with that core in the center, which, I mean, a lot's been written about it, but it doesn't seem to bother me so much. But you may want to sow your parsnips a little bit later. But up in Washington, we'd sow our parsnips around March, April, and just let them grow until they get huge. And then parsnips and rutabagas are our two most calorie-intensive crops you can grow. Even more so than potatoes, of our annuals biennials. And then to speak to what he was saying about size of garden, especially if you're looking for your most calories and or most nutrients, vitamins, go for that. But also look at like, what do I like to go to that I can grow in the winter here, and what's most expensive in the winter, and focus on a couple of those items, And I just want to give another shout out to parsley, because parsley is so vitamin rich, and it's so high in chlorophyll. It's just a durable plant. I mean, it can get beat up. And then finally, there are the smaller celeries for people that like celery. I recommend the smaller varieties of celery, like Parcel. Some of those have insane overwinterability. Just a brief story. One year, somebody gave me a pile of these for seed, and the plants were about this tall, about 3-4 inches tall, and had them in a box, in a wax cardboard box, and it filled up with water, and it was on the shady side of the house, and that water became ice, and then we had an ice storm in Washington, and it was ice for 2 weeks, and then after that it froze, and I was like, oh no, when I remembered that they were there, and I got out the trusty leaves, which are everywhere during that time of year. It's best to pile them up and put a tarp over them so you can use them for the mulch, so they're not as wet and soggy. They're not as useful when they're wet and soggy. I threw some leaves over top of that to protect it, and I forgot about it again. How neglectful of me, right? And when I uncovered it after, it was like February, and I was like, oh God, they were searching for the light, and I put them in the ground, and there was about 40 of them, and only a few of them had died. So I'm just saying that while normal parsley, you can't do it. I don't recommend growing parsley in your garden unless if you really, really love it. But I do recommend growing the small. So yeah, but celery and parsley, to me, like they really go hand in hand. I know I conflated the two a little bit, but anyway, just such a rich flavor that you can have for yourself in the winter.
So is parcel a mix of parsley and celery?
At one time, people thought that, but it's just a celery. It's an older type of celery that's used as a cutting. So the first celeries were adapted for leafy greens, and, well, for medicine actually, and then for leafy greens. And only in the 1600s they adapted for the stalk. But most of the breeding's been done in the south, southern climates like Italy or California, and so they're no good. The bigger celeries are no good for overwintering.
Our leaf celeries are some of the hardest crops we find that we grow through the winter. Adaptive seed carried a variety up until the last couple of years ago called
Hollow Pipe of Molinas.
Hollow Pipe of Molinas, which is absolutely superb.
Could you repeat that?
Hollow Pipe of Molinas. It's a very short, low-growing plant, incredibly hardy, and very distinctively, it's a crop that actually thrives through our winters as distinct from staggers on to the other side. One of the things that consistently sort of typifies our efforts to sort of explore which crop types and which varieties work best for us through our winters is we're trying to make the distinction between crop types and varieties, how well they photosynthesize at less than optimal levels. You'll find that some varieties barely make it through of a particular crop type. Other varieties are truly exceptional and actually grow. One of the reasons that rutabagas, for example, don't laugh at rutabagas. One of the reasons that rutabagas have emerged as a cornerstone winter crop for us in recent years is A, we brought a whole bunch of diversity in from Europe about 10 years ago that completely reshaped the face of rutabaga genetics in our bioregion. But what we found once we got that diversity in here and saw how much there was in terms of taste and flavour that we hadn't had ready access to before, was that they thrive through our winters. They can readily handle temperatures that get down to below 10 degrees for a few days at a time and push on through the other side. And if you drop a rutabaga on your foot, you'll break a bone. They are incredibly, I'm not joking, incredibly nutrient-dense crops. They thrive in our part of the world. And that's one of the things that we're basically looking to do as we determine which crops work best for our garden. It's not, this is what I want to grow, and I'm going to grow it. It's also a question of, all right, what are winters and what are my gardens here telling me about what works well, and I'll shape my diet accordingly. Fundamentally, that's what it's about to settle in. What is to go local? What is to become native to a bioregion? Can you speak up?
Last year I grew rutabaga in Colorado, turnip, and I had issues for cabbage root fly maggot. Mostly kind of damaging the skin and also just
the question was root maggots and so on and so forth coming in on root crops. Root were the ones you were talking about. We could also put radishes into that particular story. Whether using floating row cover might work, and a preference to not use floating row cover. I'd just say one thing, then perhaps you might speak to that. Typically, what we find is that the harder the crop, the more resistant they are to root maggots. We see this particularly in terms of radishes. Now, there's an incredible diversity of radishes that we can grow in our bioregion, and almost no one's doing it. Spectacular colours, and from the Asian radishes and the European radishes, purples, blacks, rainbows, and some of the radishes are much softer than others. They're the ones that tend to succumb to root pressure first. Some of the radishes are quite hard. They do very well. Rutabagas typically do quite well because they're tough as blazes. You've got to cook them for as long as it make a carrot for, really. They soften up exquisitely, but they've got that toughness. And then we see that to a degree in terms of beets and carrots. Carrots will tend to be one of the first root crops that succumbs because it's juicy and soft. And then the beets, they're a little bit more protected. They sit up above the ground, but then they'll also succumb. The rutabagas will go long. And then using row cover, which is essentially a way to keep pests crops as you're getting them established, is a very effective technique too. Did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, there's I think a couple items that have been opened up here. It's a good question. Yeah, first density matters, genetics matters. So if the plant has some chemical resistance to that issue or other issues. Nutrient density. So I really implore everybody to get a soil test. Ag Source is a good company, for instance. A complete soil test to find out what you're deficient in. And every soil is deficient in something. Compost and manure just doesn't cut it, or adding dolomite or whatever. But targeted fertilization, what is really the key? Because we're eating out of the garden, we don't want to be adding chemical. That's maybe why we're gardening. We want to eat local. Maybe why we're gardening. So we want to be feeding ourselves, our friends, and our family, and the ones that we love with as nutrient dense food as possible. The take home with that is that when your minerals are up and then their correct ratios for our garden crops, they're producing just like us. We get a little downtrodden in the winter. We get a little sad because we don't have our vitamin D. We get a little run down and sick because we're not getting our vitamins and our minerals. The same thing with the plant. So if you can keep the nutrients up on your plants, then you will have less problems. You won't have no problems because everything needs to eat. But it'll be creating more of the compounds that ward off the diseases and insects, and more of the compounds that are basically these complex alcohol molecules that exist inside plants to keep them from freezing. And that relates to the brie content or the sugar content in the vegetables. So that means that the vegetables will be crisper and sweeter and more wonderful. So strategies to exclude like the cabbage moth or carrot rust fly, which can also affect the parsnips. So you're either going to want to you're going to want to rotate if you can. If you can forego, it's hard to forego brassicas, but if you have a really bad problem, you want to forego brassicas for a year and clean up your brassica weeds, and then you'd find that population died off. And then you could also explore all the other vegetables that exist, you know. But that's a tough one. One of my friends even used like a hand shot back. It's really hard to like get the moths. Like they just seem to always get away, but you can actually shot back up the moths. So, and then the only other way really is either going to be exclusion or using something nasty, which I personally wouldn't use, like spinosad or BT, which are both kill off a wide range of insects, even though they're both can be approved. Spinosad is approved for organic production. BT can be approved for organic production, but I just don't like that approach. I think that I don't know. I don't take many hardline stances, but I guess that's my feeling on it, you know. So
You don't ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Come back, come back to you.
yes,
Yeah.
so small flower stuff. So stuff in the carrot family, and the more plants that you can be planting throughout the year in the carrot family are really great. The teasel family, we have that wheat teasel that grows around here.